pages recoil tonight, as if the ancient tome itself cannot bear to reveal this truth. Here, written in gold ink that is turned to poison, I find the Brothers Grimm's most insidious documentation, not a fairy tale about transformation, but a grooming manual that taught little girls to accept what no child should ever endure. This book has shown me genocides disguised as legends, famines transformed into fairy tales, but tonight it reveals something that makes even my centuries-old soul shudder with rage. The Frog Prince isn't about magical transformation or true love conquering all. It's a step-by-step guide to breaking a child's resistance, normalizing sexual coercion, and teaching young girls that their promises, no matter how extracted through manipulation, bind them to a lifetime of submission. Welcome back, seekers of forgotten truths. The frog was never magical, it was powerful. And the kiss that broke his spell was unlove. It was the moment a child learned to stop saying no. Once upon a time, there lived a beautiful young princess who loved to play with her golden ball by the castle Eswell. One day, the ball fell into the deep water, and the princess wept bitterly for her lost toy. A frog emerged from the well and offered to retrieve her ball, but only if she would promise to be his companion, to let him eat from her plate, drink from her cup, and sleep in her bed. Desperate to have her golden ball back, the princess agreed to the frog's demands. The frog dove into the well and returned her precious toy. But once she had what she wanted, the princess ran away, forgetting all about her promise to the ugly creature. The next evening, as the princess dined with her father the king, there came a knocking at the castle door. When they opened it, there sat the frog, demanding that the princess honor her word. The king, learning of his daughter's promise, commanded her to keep it, saying that a royal promise must never be broken. Reluctantly, the princess allowed the frog to eat from her golden plate and drink from her golden cup. But when he demanded to sleep in her bed, she was filled with disgust and threw him against the wall with all her might. At that moment, the frog transformed into a handsome prince, who revealed that he had been under a wicked spell that could only be broken by the princess's actions. The prince and princess were married and lived happily ever after, ruling their kingdom with wisdom and joy. It sounds like a charming story about keeping promises and looking beyond appearances to find true worth. But the ancient pages before me bleed with a different truth, because this wasn't a fairy tale at all. It was a manual, an instruction guide used by medieval nobility to prepare young girls for the reality of arranged marriages, to teach them that resistance was futile and that their happiness lay in accepting whatever powerful men demanded of them. To understand the true horror of the Frog Prince, you need to understand the legal and social reality of medieval Europe, where children, particularly girls, were treated as property to be traded between powerful families for political and economic gain. In medieval canon law, girls could be betrothed at age 7 and married as young as 12. These weren't rare exceptions. They were standard practice among the nobility, who used marriage as the primary tool for cementing alliances, acquiring territory, and preserving bloodlines. The ancient tome trembles as it reveals the documented evidence. Marriage contracts from the period show systematic trafficking of children between noble houses. A contract from 1240 between the houses of Plantagenet and Provence arranges the marriage of Eleanor, age 9, to Edmund, age 34. The document specifies that training in wifely duties will begin immediately, though consummation will be delayed until the bride reaches sufficient maturity, typically interpreted as the onset of menstruation. These weren't isolated cases. English royal records document dozens of similar arrangements. Isabella de Forres married at age 9 to Maurice de Berkeley, age 41. Joan of England betrothed at age 11 to Alexander II of Scotland, age 46. Margaret of England married at age 10 to Alexander III of Scotland, then age 20. The pattern was consistent across medieval Europe. Young girls traded like commodities to much older men for political advantage. But the most disturbing aspect of these arrangements wasn't just the age difference. It was the systematic process used to break down the children's resistance and teach them to accept their fate. Medieval household records describe detailed training programs for child brides, designed to overcome their natural reluctance and mold them into compliant wives. The Frog Prince story preserves this training process with terrifying accuracy. The frog's initial approach by the well represents the first stage of grooming the predator, positioning himself as a helper, someone who can solve the child's problems. The golden ball that falls into the well isn't just a toy. It represents the child's innocence, her carefree existence that is about to be lost forever. The frog's demands escalate systematically, first to be her companion, then to eat from her plate, then to drink from her cup, finally to sleep in her bed. This progression mirrors the documented grooming techniques used by medieval nobles to gradually normalize inappropriate contact with their child brides. Start with social interaction, move to sharing meals, then to intimate domestic arrangements, and finally to sexual access. The princess's initial resistance, her disgust at the frog's demands, her attempt to break her promise and run away, reflects the natural response of children to these arrangements. Medieval records are filled with accounts of young girls who tried to escape their betrothal contracts, who refused to eat or speak, who became ill from distress at their situation. But the most crucial element of the story is the king's intervention. When the frog comes to the castle demanding that the princess honor her promise, it's the king, her father, her protector, who forces her to comply. He tells her that a royal promise must never be broken, that she must honor her word regardless of her feelings. This represents the systematic betrayal that these children experienced from their own families. Parents who should have protected them instead delivered them to their abusers. Using concepts of honor, duty, and family loyalty to override the children's obvious distress. Medieval records show that noble families often used exactly this language: the importance of keeping promises, the duty to family honor, to force resistant children into unwanted marriages. The princess's final act of throwing the frog against the wall, which triggers his transformation into a handsome prince, represents the moment of complete psychological breakdown that these training programs were designed to achieve. When a child finally stops resisting, when she gives up hope of escape and accepts her fate, the situation can be reframed as a positive transformation. The frog's reveal as a handsome prince serves multiple psychological functions. It provides retroactive justification for the coercion, suggesting that the child's suffering was actually a test that led to a wonderful reward. It reframes the abuser as a victim himself, under a spell that required the child's actions to break. Most insidiously, it teaches the child that her happiness depends on accepting whatever powerful men demand. No matter how repulsive those demands initially seem, medieval marriage contracts often included clauses that reveal the reality behind this transformation. Documents specify that child brides will receive additional privileges, better living conditions, and more autonomy once they demonstrate proper wifely compliance. The handsome prince represents the improved treatment that awaited girls who stopped resisting their circumstances. But this ancient book shows me something even more disturbing: evidence that the frog prince wasn't just reflecting these practices, but was actually used as a tool to implement them. Household records from medieval noble families describe the systematic use of stories and fairy tales as part of the preparation process for child brides. Young girls would be told stories like the Frog Prince repeatedly in the months leading up to their marriages. With explicit instruction about the moral lessons they were supposed to learn, manuscripts from the period include marginalia that function as grooming. Instructions emphasize the importance of keeping promises, discuss the rewards of obedience, explain that initial disgust will transform into happiness. The story was specifically designed to overcome the natural resistance that children showed to these arrangements. By presenting the progression from disgust to acceptance as a magical transformation, it taught girls that their initial revulsion was not to be trusted, that their feelings of fear and violation were obstacles to overcome rather than valid responses to abuse. Church records from the period reveal how religious authorities participated in this systematic grooming. Priests would use the Frog Prince in similar stories and sermons specifically addressed to young girls, explaining that obedience to male authority, even when it felt wrong, was a Christian virtue that would be rewarded by God. A sermon manuscript from 1287, preserved in the Canterbury Cathedral archives, explicitly connects the Frog Prince to marriage preparation. As the princess learned to love what she first found repulsive, so must young wives learn that their happiness lies in submission to their husband's will, however distasteful their duties may initially seem. The golden ball in the story represents more than just innocence. It symbolizes the commodification of female virginity, that was central to these medieval marriage contracts. Noble families literally priced their daughters' virginity, with marriage contracts specifying compensation for defloration and detailed medical examinations to verify the bride's purity, both before and after the wedding. The well where the ball falls represents the liminal space where these transactions occurred, neither fully public nor completely private. A place where normal social rules were suspended, and where children could be isolated with their predators. Medieval castle layouts often included such spaces specifically designed for these purposes. Garden alcoves, private chambers, and other locations where child brides could be prepared away from potential interference. The frog's emergence from the well represents the revelation of the predator's true nature, not the kind helper he initially appeared to be, but someone who had been watching, waiting for the right moment to make his demands. The well's depth, which prevents the princess from retrieving her own ball, represents the child's helplessness in a system designed to make her dependent on adult men for everything she needed. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. Excavations at medieval castle sites have uncovered wells and water features that show evidence of having been used for purposes beyond their ostensible function. Hidden chambers connected to well structures, private passages that allowed discreet access, and architectural features designed to facilitate surveillance all point to the systematic nature of these arrangements. The specific details of the frog's demands, eating from the princess's plate, drinking from her cup, sleeping in her bed, correspond exactly to the progression of intimacy documented in medieval marriage preparation records. These weren't random magical requirements. They were the actual stages through which child brides were forced to accept increasing levels of inappropriate contact. Medieval household manuals describe exactly this progression. First, the child would be required to share meals with her future husband, despite her obvious discomfort. Then she would be expected to participate in increasingly intimate domestic arrangements. Finally, she would be required to accept sexual contact with the understanding that resistance would be met with punishment, while compliance would be rewarded with better treatment. The transformation of the frog into a prince represents the psychological manipulation technique known today as trauma bonding, the process by which victims develop positive feelings toward their abusers as a survival mechanism. When the only way to improve one's situation is to please the person causing harm, victims often develop genuine feelings of attachment and even love toward their tormentors. Medieval records document this phenomenon with chilling precision. Household accounts describe child brides who initially showed clear signs of distress, refusing to eat, crying constantly, attempting to escape, but who gradually became model wives, defending their husbands against criticism and expressing gratitude for their marriages. These transformations weren't evidence of successful relationships. They were evidence of successful brainwashing. The girls had learned that survival depended on convincing themselves and others that they were happy with their circumstances. The handsome prince represented not genuine love, but the Stockholm syndrome that developed as a psychological defense mechanism. The happily ever after ending serves to reinforce this programming by suggesting that the child's ultimate happiness proves the entire process was beneficial. It teaches readers that initial resistance to unwanted sexual contact is misguided, that submission leads to reward, and that children who comply with adult demands will be better off than those who resist. But the ancient tome reveals an even more disturbing layer to this story. Linguistic analysis of different versions of the Frog Prince shows systematic modifications over time designed to make the grooming process more effective. Earlier versions of the story included more explicit resistance from the princess, more detailed descriptions of her disgust and fear, and more gradual progression toward acceptance. Later versions, particularly those compiled by the Brothers Grimm, show evidence of deliberate editing to streamline the grooming narrative. Details that might encourage children to trust their own feelings of revulsion were removed. The princess's resistance was minimized. The transformation was made more sudden and complete, eliminating any suggestion that the child might maintain legitimate concerns about her situation. The Brothers Grimm weren't just collecting folklore. They were participating in an ongoing project to refine and distribute grooming materials. Their version of the Frog Prince represents the culmination of centuries of testing and modification to create the most effective possible tool for breaking down children. Resistance to sexual abuse. Modern analysis of medieval marriage records reveals the devastating effectiveness of these techniques. Girls who underwent this systematic preparation showed much lower rates of attempted escape, rebellion, or resistance to their circumstances. They were more likely to produce heirs quickly, more likely to defend their marriages against criticism, and more likely to replicate these patterns with their own daughters. The long-term psychological damage, however, was severe and well documented. Medical records from the period describe a condition among noble wives, characterized by what we would now recognize as symptoms of complex PTSD dissociation, learned helplessness, chronic depression, and the inability to form healthy attachments with their own children. Many of these women died young, often in childbirth, sometimes from what medieval physicians described as melancholia, a wasting condition that modern psychiatrists would recognize as severe depression complicated by trauma. The happily ever after promised by the Frog Prince was, for most of these women, a brief and tragic lie. The story's persistence in modern culture represents the ongoing power of these grooming narratives to shape expectations about relationships and consent. Children who grow up with the Frog Prince learn that initial revulsion toward sexual contact should be overcome rather than trusted. That promises to predators are more binding than their own comfort and safety, and that their happiness depends on accepting whatever powerful people demand of them. This programming continues to affect how modern society understands consent, particularly in relationships with significant power imbalances. The story teaches that resistance is just an obstacle to overcome, that no doesn't really mean no if you can find the right leverage, and that victims who eventually stop fighting must have secretly wanted the abuse all along. The pages of this ancient tome grow heavy with the weight of names, thousands of medieval girls whose childhoods were destroyed by the system that the Frog Prince was designed to maintain. They were told their stories would end happily if they just stopped resisting, if they learned to love what they initially found repulsive, if they honored promises that had been extracted through manipulation and coercion. But their real endings were written in medical records that document lives cut short by trauma, and legal documents that show them repeating these patterns with their own daughters, and in the archaeological evidence of graves that hold too many young women who never lived to see genuine happiness. The Frog Prince still exists in our modern culture, wearing new masks but using the same techniques. He appears as the older man who convinces teenage girls that their parents just do understand their mature relationship. He is the authority figure who teaches children that their discomfort with his behavior is just immaturity they need to overcome. He is the system that tells victims their healing depends on forgiveness and acceptance rather than justice and accountability. Tonight, as these poison pages whisper their warnings, I remember why this book chose me as its guardian, not to preserve pretty lies about transformation and true love, but to expose the machinery of abuse that has been hidden behind fairy tale magic for centuries. The ancient tome closes with a sound like breaking bones, its revelation complete, the echo of children's voices, crying out in fear before learning that their cries would not be heard, would not be honored, would only make their suffering worse, will haunt these pages until the end of time. Tomorrow night, the book will reveal another horror disguised as harmless entertainment, another beloved story that teaches children to accept the unacceptable, to normalize the abnormal, to find happiness in their own destruction. But tonight, we remember the real princesses. Not the ones who learned to love their frogs, but the thousands who never got the chance to grow up free. From the wells that swallowed their golden balls, the promises that bound them to predators, and the transformations that broke their spirits while everyone around them celebrated their supposed happiness. Their voices echo still in these blood-stained pages. And as long as this book exists, as long as I draw breath to speak their truth, they will not be forgotten. The reckoning continues.